So now that brings me to the pleasure of introducing our speaker for the evening, Patricia Pearce. Patricia is someone I have known, as have some other people in this room, known since 2003 and perhaps earlier, but many of us met her when she was one of the people who took the Iraqi Pledge of Resistance to shut down the courthouse in Philadelphia if we went to war in Iraq, which we did. And she and Janelle Ravindell were cellmates for a week. And Janelle's pamphlet will introduce you to Patricia a little bit more. I can't remember if it's a wonderful week in behind bars, but it's something like that.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
And it's colored orange like her jumpsuit. So Patricia was in the Peace Corps, and I'm now not remembering, was it Ecuador? In Ecuador, and her experience with the Andean people was where she had her illumination that she was called to the ministry. She's a native of Denver, and she went to San Francisco Theological Seminary and got her MDiv there. She served the congregation as a minister at Tabernacle United Church in University City for 12 and a half years. And it was the death of a very close friend that caused revelations to come to Patricia about the true meaning behind Jesus' message. Her book, Beyond Jesus, was just recently published. It's on sale here, as well as her other earlier book, No One in I Land. And they'll be available for sale and signing after our talk this evening. So she has left the ministry, but she is active in many ways, and blogging and writing and speaking. And we're very delighted to welcome her back to Pendle Hill this evening. So please welcome her. Would you prefer to speak out of the silence or to the round of applause coming from the... Some people like to calm themselves and just...
Considering that we're at Pendle Hill, I think silence would be...
Okay, well, let's settle into a period of worshipful silence, and when you're ready to turn on your speaker and proceed, we're welcome to have you. She'll speak for about 50 minutes or so, and then I'll come around with the microphone for questions.
The best of times, the worst of times. I'm guessing that a lot of us don't need any help seeing our present times as the worst of times. So I'm not really going to dwell on that tonight. We can look at the New York Times, we can look at any media, any day, and be pretty persuaded that we are possibly living in the worst of times. However, I also believe that we are living at perhaps the most exciting and hopeful time that this planet has ever seen. And that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. And what my goal is tonight is to give you a pair of glasses, to give you lenses with which to see our present time differently than we might be seeing it through the media and through social media and our daily interactions, so that we can see things from a larger perspective and then know how we can participate in these times as a healing and peaceful force. And I also believe that how we are perceiving what's happening is crucial. I still remember the first driving lesson that I ever had. My driving instructor's name was Red. I had driving classes at the AAA. And of course, as a driving instructor, Red was pretty low-key, which I think is a job requirement. And the moment that I got behind the steering wheel, the first thing he said when we pulled out, he said, "Now you will instinctively drive towards whatever you're looking at." So what are we looking at? We need to be mindful of that, because that is where we will just automatically and unconsciously head. So, why is this such an exciting time in our world right now? It is because we are presently at the end of what I call the ego era. The ego era is passing away. So what do I mean by ego? Well, I know that this is a word that is used by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. Psychologists use it one way, other people use it another way. I'm going to share with you a story that will help you understand how I use the term. And this is a passage that I am taking from my book, Beyond Jesus. And as John mentioned in the introduction, after a close friend of mine died in 2001, she was somebody that I had met in seminary, and she really had been like a soul companion for me. And when she died after a bone marrow transplant, I knew that there was something to my life and something to my existence that I had never really experienced or comprehended. And there was something about her death that caused in me this resolve not to live my life on the surface, but to open up to this hidden dimension that I sensed was there and I didn't know it was. And so it was about 1.5 years after that, I had renewed my commitment on spiritual retreat. And it was in 2002, and I started experiencing all these synchronicities. It was like I found myself in this tsunami of synchronicities that my worldview simply could not accommodate. And my way of seeing things was just starting to fall apart. And this is, I'll pick it up from there. The synchronicities were causing my world to crack apart. I was falling through the looking glass into a different reality where the rules of causality didn't apply. I felt as though I were a character in a magical realist novel being written by some unseen hand. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that I needed to surrender to it, and I needed to go to the woods to do it. It was a Friday afternoon in late July, hot and humid. As I began my hike into the woods, a light rain started to fall. I headed for a secluded place I knew where I sometimes went to meditate, and sat down on a large rock overlooking the Wissahickon Gorge. The branches of a nearby oak sheltered me as the rain began to fall harder. I didn't know what to do. All I could think of was to give thanks for all the people in my life. I sensed that whatever was happening to me was happening because of my web of relationships. I turned my face to the sky. Thank you for Sarah. Thank you for Gwen. As soon as I started naming the names, a sudden realization flooded my being. I was not a discrete self, isolated in my own existence, as I had always perceived myself to be. I was a dynamic pattern, constantly changing, expressing the interplay of an infinite number of interacting influences, like ripples constantly dancing and colliding on the surface of water. In a flash, I comprehended not only the interconnectedness of reality, but of my own interconnectedness with reality. I, as a separate entity, did not exist. Isolation and separateness had only been erroneous ideas in my mind. With that realization, waves of energy began to cascade through my body, pulsating through me. I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. I could feel that something was being set free at the deepest levels of my being. I was being birthed into a new reality. As the waves of energy began to subside, the rain began to let up. When I opened my eyes, I saw a world I had never seen before. Everything. The pool of tears at my feet, the rock, the trees, the sparkling mica-laden soil, everything was vibrant and alive, luminous, infused with a presence. No, not merely a presence, a sentience. Nothing was inanimate. Everything was expressing a life, a totality, a complete oneness, love itself. Beholding the beauty of all that was around me, an immense hope for the earth filled my being. I knew that a profound shift was underway, not just in me, but across the entire planet. I had no doubt that if enough people were to give themselves over to this inbreaking of love, the earth itself could be healed. And so when I talk about ego, I'm talking about that moment of recognition that all of my life I had believed I was one thing, and that was simply an illusion. So in my lexicon, ego is a false self that is generated by the mind, is operating from the erroneous concept of separateness. A false self generated by the mind, operating from an erroneous concept of separateness. Now, this concept of separateness is the thing that we have been inhabiting for a very long time on this planet as human beings. As individuals, as a species, we live in this idea that we are separate beings, living our isolated lives. And this is the consciousness, this is the worldview, this is the paradigm that right now is flying apart. It is flying apart, and it is being replaced with this understanding of complete oneness, that there is no such thing as separateness. So, let us look for a moment at the world that separateness built. Because the world that we inhabit, the world that we have created, has arisen from the consciousness that we have inhabited, which has been that of the ego, that of separateness. Well, clearly, when we believe that we are discrete individuals, we are prone to dividing ourselves into distinct nation states, vying with one another for resources and power. We also have a world in which racism can exist, when we see others as others, a world where people can be marginalized. We have a world of sexism and misogyny. We have a world in which there is tremendous economic disparity. All of this arising from this idea that we are separate from one another. We, of course, devote a lot of our resources and a lot of our ingenuity into military, into new weapons and bolstering our military capacity. And of course, we exploit the earth. We see ourselves as separate from the earth, and we believe that we can just simply exploit the earth as though it were simply a resource for our consumption. So all of this is the world that separateness has built. And I see it in shorthand as empire. Essentially, we have built a world of empire. And what is empire? Empire is a political, economic, military system of dominance generated by the ego. So the ego is this inner experience of being separate, and it expresses itself globally in the form of empire. So we have this ego consciousness that is now being challenged. And we are in this moment. This is what is so interesting about the moment in which we live. We are experiencing collective consciousness dissonance. We have been inhabiting this ego mind for a long time, and now the foundations of that worldview are shaking, and they are shaking big time. Yay! Yay! Yeah, yay! Exactly. And how is this consciousness, or this consciousness dissonance happening? What is shaking the foundations of our false egoic self? Well, this is one, pivotal archetypal moment in human history. I heard this photograph referred to recently as our first selfie. When the Apollo 8 mission went to the moon, and nobody at NASA ever thought, oh wow, we're going to be able to see the Earth. It never dawned on anyone. The Apollo 8 mission was going to circle the moon and scope out a good place for a lunar landing. That was their mission. And wow, all of a sudden they look out the window, and this is what they see. And when you see that, you understand that we are in this together. That we are one global community of life. You feel the foundations of that worldview starting, the tremors are beginning. Genomic research. Coming to understand that all life on this planet shares the same 4 amino acids. All of us, everything that is alive is sharing the same basic building blocks of our DNA. Our growing understanding of living systems, how everything in a living system interacts with everything else in the living system. And you can't remove anything from that system without affecting the whole. Has anybody seen that YouTube video about what happened when the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone? If you haven't, check it out. The wolves were reintroduced, and literally the whole ecosystem changed, and even the course of the river changed. Quantum physics, and especially non-locality. How can this be that 2 particles that were once connected now can be separated light years apart, and they will simultaneously change their spin? They don't even have time to talk to each other. There's somehow, some way in which there's an underlying oneness, an underlying connection. Cosmology. and our investigations into the origin of the universe, the Big Bang, how everything that we see, everything that we experience in this world originated from a moment, an explosive moment of energy. And the carbon in our bodies was formed by stars going supernova that flung their material out into the universe. We are literally stardust. And they hypothesized that the water on our planet was deposited here by comets, flying by and leaving some of their vapor trail behind. We are connected with the entire universe. Our technology that has connected us through the internet, where we can instantaneously communicate with one another and we can share the vast resources of our collective knowledge with one another. And also the rise in the practice of mindfulness, meditation, the increasing interest in spirituality, where that's when we look inward. We look inward into our own minds, and we discover there the reality of our interconnectedness and our beingness. So all of these things. And the thing, of course, that has the timer running on this transition between these eras of consciousness is climate change. This is the thing that is really, literally lighting the fire under us to make this shift, to let go of this illusory ego mind and to make this shift. We understand that the activity that we have generated from this consciousness of separateness is now imperiling our future and the future of much of the life on the planet. And so Earth is participating in this awakening of our consciousness away from this idea of separateness. So all of these things now are converging. And they are upsetting our established ways of seeing things. And that's scary. That's very disturbing. And so one of the things that we're witnessing now, which makes us seem like the worst of times, is we're watching the ego's last stand. The ego's last stand. This attempt to hold onto a worldview that is crumbling. Build that wall. Think about it. Build the wall. Reinforce this idea of separateness. Global warming is a fraud. Deny the evidence. Hold on to the idea that we can exist as a separate species and we'll be okay. Make our country first again. Reinforce this idea of supremacy, of exceptionalism, of hierarchy. Make our country first again. And this ego's last stand is not partisan, by the way. It's not partisan. Fascist scum, your time is done. You see what's happening. Seeing them as separate and other, and the problem. Burning Trump in effigy, as though I, or any of us, is separate from any other being. So, the star, when it has lived its life and spent its fuel, if it's a big enough star, it doesn't just vanish into the darkness. No, it goes supernova. It flares out the last of its life in this very dramatic flash of energy and light. And what I believe is right now we are watching the ego going supernova. because that consciousness has spent its fuel. It can't take us into the future that we need to be moving into. So, all of this, as I said, is based in fear, this last stand. And it's understandable because we really do not know what the world looks like without our egoic structures and our egoic way of seeing things. And so we are moving into the unknown, and that always, of course, elicits fear. And so I think it's helpful for us to remember when we see this, this explosion of supernova to know what's behind it, and that is fear. And so at this moment, we find ourselves in this moment of crisis, in which this worldview, this consciousness, this egoic illusion is collapsing. And we are in a moment of crisis. And it is not a crisis that is affecting only one region. This is a global crisis. Now, we've all probably heard, and it's become quite cliche at this point, about the characters in Chinese that make up crisis, right? It's dangerous, opportunity, the two characters. Dangerous, opportunity, you bet. But what I want to talk about is the word crisis in English. Our word crisis comes from the Greek crises, which means decision. And so crisis actually is a decision. And the first time it was used in English, it was a medical term, back in the 15th century. Crisis in English was first used, the word was first used strictly as a medical term. And what crisis meant was the decisive point in the progress of a disease. The turning point in a disease, that change which indicates recovery or death. A point at which change must come, for better or worse. In other words, crisis is that moment where the status quo is simply not going to be happening. It is a turning point, a decisive turning point. And if we think about crisis as a decision, then it is a decision that we are all participating in and that we all have the power to influence. So, I'm a Trekkie. Is anybody else here a Trekkie? Does anybody ever watch? A few of them. Voyager, did you ever watch Voyager? Yes. Okay, so you know that on Voyager there's a holographic doctor, right?
Yes.
And when the doctor comes online, what is the first thing he says? What is the nature of the medical emergency?
Yeah.
That's what he always says. You know, he materializes out of thin air, and he just says, what is the nature of the medical emergency? So, if we are in a crisis, what is the nature of the medical emergency? Well, before I get into that, I have a question for you all. Does anybody here know what the largest living organism is on the planet?
A tree. Aspen. The aspen?
I thought it was a fungus. It grows on the ground.
You guys are good. You're way beyond a whale. That's right. So they thought, okay, it was the fungus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a fungus that okay, what is the disease? We're getting into that right now. So it's a fungus in Oregon that is 3.5 square miles in size, and it is one living organism. And it's thousands of years old. It's sometimes called the honey mushroom. Sometimes it's called the humongous fungus. And yes, before they discovered this fungus in Oregon, they thought that the largest living organism was a stand of aspen in Utah. A single root system, a single organism that covered, I don't even know how many acres of land.
Is that in Oregon? No, you said.
This is in Utah, the humongous fungus is in Oregon. So can you imagine, just for a moment, okay, so this aspen is all one living organism that is expressing itself. You know, it pops up from the ground and it's expressing itself in these apparently separate trees. So can you imagine what it would be like if, say, this aspen started to attack the aspen next to it? You think, wow, this is one confused aspen. The aspen is attacking itself. What is our name for that kind of a disease, where the body attacks itself?
Oh, I don't know.
It's an autoimmune disease. Earth is suffering from an autoimmune disease that is in the mind of the human species. An autoimmune disease is where the body gets confused about what it is, and it sees itself as its enemy, and it attacks itself. So really, in a way, we are in the throes of this crisis moment of an autoimmune disease. So, when we think about how this disease has been expressing itself, we see that not a mushroom colony, not a mushroom organism, but we develop weaponry that is such an advanced and sophisticated way of attacking that we could actually decimate much of life on Earth. So our autoimmune disease is really playing out big time. So right now, this is the moment. These are the consciousnesses that right now are commingling for a moment. This previous consciousness of the ego, which is based in attack, it's based in the idea of separateness. And separateness and the ego reinforces itself by attack and blame and shame. So the mushroom cloud we can think of as the epitome of an egoic consciousness in which the body is attacking itself. This is one of the fullest expressions of our autoimmune disease. And we are moving into the consciousness of recognition that we are all one, that there is only actually one life on the planet, that we are all participating in. And so right now, we are living right in this little juncture, right there. That's where we are. And I don't know about you, but for me, I mean, some days I'm here, and some days I'm here. And sometimes I can flip back and forth very, very quickly. See, we are living in this moment where, like, whoa, what is going on? It's almost like a whiplash kind of a moment, when this old way is dying and this new one has yet really to come fully into our awareness. So if we are suffering from an autoimmune disease, well then what is the cure? What is the cure for this autoimmune disease? Well, obviously the first thing is to avoid attack. It's pretty obvious. But really, the cure, of course, is love. Because love is the recognition. Love really is oneness, the truth of oneness. And when we are coming from that understanding of love, we have the power to heal the mind of its own illusion. I know some of us have heard the story of Sarah Silverman, right? Comedian. Has anybody else heard this story of Sarah Silverman, the comedian, and what happened with this Twitter exchange that she had?
Oh, yeah.
With a troll. It was amazing. So she got this very crude tweet from what's called a troll, attacking her, using a very misogynistic term for her, and rather than attacking back, which of course is like the customary way to do things, right? You attack back when you've been attacked. She did something very different. She started to research this guy's Twitter feed and find out more about him. And she started to see and recognize the pain that he was living with. And she started to engage with him on Twitter and saying, I see your pain. You've really been going through a hard time. She expressed compassion. And she didn't only do that. She found out that he was suffering from back pain, severe back pain. He lived in Austin. And so she put out to her Twitter followers, does anybody know a good back doctor in Austin? And then people started contributing funds for his medical care. And this guy was just blown away. You see, she wasn't following the script. She wasn't following the egoic script. She was doing something completely unexpected. She was seeing him not as a troll, but as a human being who was suffering and feeling alone and who needed support. Those sorts of acts, you see how those sorts of acts also send ripples and shockwaves through this idea that we're separate from one another. And they can begin to heal the mind that's caught up in that illusion. That experience of being an isolated individual on this planet all alone and nobody cares about me. Wow. So the cure is love. It's very simple. And it's seeing the humanity of the other. And it's being in these times from a stance of nonviolence. I mean, in essence, it's, being a good Quaker. Right? It's being a good Quaker. That's what these times are really calling for. So, how do we live into this? How do we start to assume our own role and claim our own capacity to be in these times differently? Well, if an autoimmune disease is really about self-attack, then we have to begin with looking within. Because that's where the attack begins. And it's quite something to really start to notice, how often do I see myself as the enemy? How often am I attacking myself? See, that's where it all starts. That mushroom cloud is just that idea writ large. And so to let go of self-attack enables us to then be present to others in a truly loving way. I was walking the labyrinth once, this was out in New Mexico, and I was on retreat there, and I was walking this amazing labyrinth in this place that I love to go. And when I walk the labyrinth, I don't usually go with an agenda. I usually just go, open to whatever wants to offer itself. And I'd been on retreat for several days at that point, and I really hadn't interacted with a lot of other people. I was doing a solitary retreat. And as I'm walking the labyrinth this day, all of a sudden into my mind comes this instruction that says, release all concept of enemy. And I'm like, what? I wasn't thinking about enemies, but okay. And then it went on to say, there are no enemies. There are only those who do not know who they are. There are no enemies. There are only those who do not know who they are. Which again is the autoimmune disease. The body not knowing who and what it is. So all of this truly is what I want you to come away with, is to understand that we change the world by changing the consciousness that gives rise to the world. And that from that consciousness, that awareness of our interconnectedness, that consciousness of love, then we create a very different world. A very different world. And actually, John, in your announcements, this movement for the rights of nature. You know, we are moving into this understanding that, wow, we are not separate on this planet. So this is happening. It's not the kind of thing that you'll find highlighted in the media, but it is happening under the radar. So all of this then really is, I think of it as the awakening of the heart. Because the heart is that chakra of connectivity. The heart already knows oneness. The heart already knows that there is no separateness. And so this shift of consciousness is when the mind, which perceives things through this lens of comparison and contrast, when the mind awakens to the knowing of the heart, then we are in a very different place. So the awakening of the heart is that the shift of consciousness that we are now experiencing, in which we come into this knowing that we one. So thank you, and there will be time for questions.
I think we can, in fact. Which is not to diminish the gravity of your message. So friends, I'm going to come around with a microphone. A reminder that this is very directional, so that if you want to be heard and so that our friends at home will be able to hear you, hold it right the way I'm holding it, right below your lip. You can even rest it on your chin if you forget how close you need to hold it. This works perfectly well. So I don't mind starting off, but I'll let you think of your questions while I do one. So your awakening to the way you have elaborated on the revelations that came to you during that period of wandering and retreating. Clearly there had been, first of all, some spiritual spade work that you had done over the years that let there be a fertile ground on which that seed could fall. And so part of me is wondering when the egoic world that we have created and lived in accelerates and moves faster and faster, and more people have to work 2 jobs just to get by and are afraid they're going to get sick because they won't be able to afford it, that the idea of perpetuating an atmosphere and consciousness where fear dominates is part of the enterprise of maintaining the egoic empire. And fewer people have the wherewithal to take a retreat, to take the time to be mindful, to even get to the level where that consciousness can awaken. And so that is where my wondering comes from, is how do we then create spaces, times, ways for people to pull away and take the time to gain that awareness.
Yeah.
That it isn't like at the end of time, that it's like, oh geez, I really should have paid closer attention.
Yeah, and that is part of, am I still on? Okay. That is part of this moment where, and you're absolutely right, John, I absolutely agree with you, that perpetuating fear is part of the plan, definitely, absolutely. And also turning us, trying to, place wedges between us is part of it. And so, and yes, you're right, I mean, there are a whole lot of people who don't have the luxury of going on retreat or taking, half an hour in the morning to meditate, which for me also says both we have to be doing our due diligence to change those systems, and also, and I also do believe that part of our due diligence is this inner work. So those of us who can do that right now, we have to understand that we're not just doing it for ourselves. Right. We are doing it for the whole, because there's no separateness. And so the more, it's just, it is that one root system. So the more that I can align myself with the consciousness of love, the more I am allowing that to feed into the whole. So, so it's both, clearly we need to be advocating for systemic change. There's no question about that. But for me, the question is, what consciousness are we bringing to that activity? Am I seeing, my conservative senator as my enemy, and when I call him up, I'm like, really, if I'm doing that, I am feeding that egoic consciousness into that root system. I'm feeding it, I'm perpetuating it. So if I can call him up and understand that, this is a human being, this person is part of this whole life force that I'm part of, the neighboring aspen tree. And if I can interact from that stance of nonviolence and love, that's really the only way things are going to shift. Because the thing is, the Tao talks about, a lot of spiritual teachings talk about this, that the more you resist against something, the more you're actually empowering it. Mm-hmm. The more energy you're feeding into it. So we have to be aware that, and I don't even like the word resistance, because that I'm bringing my energy in this oppositional way towards an issue or another person. I prefer the word, this is sort of my kind of hokey word, but resistance. How can we begin to demonstrate the truth that we are in this together? You see, all of this is based in fear. And so if I assume a stance of, we're going to get Congress back and we're going to show those people, well, that simply feeds into the fear that somebody's going to be left out. And that is the fear, that I'm going to be left out of this new world. Nobody cares about me. So if we can do things and interact in ways that destabilize that very idea, then we actually can begin to make change. Transformation happens through the power of, I would say, fierce love. Fierce love. that will not exclude anyone. That's the nature of love. Love is all-encompassing. Love is unconditional. Otherwise, it's not love. So can we stand fiercely in that understanding that no one is excluded? No one. No one.
And that, I think, is where the real Jesus message that we were called to, that you and I talked about the other day. So the beyond Jesus is that.
Yes.
We're not putting Jesus on the egoic
Exactly.
pedestal. We're saying, no, no, no.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what my book really talks about. It's a memoir, but it traces my journey of recognizing how much that egoic consciousness has shaped Christian belief. And how we have misunderstood what Jesus was about because we looked at him through this lens of separateness. Oh, he's different. You know, he's separate from the rest of humanity.
Oh, he's God.
He's God, and we aren't. Right. And what I believe is, and what I actually really, he confronted empire.
And exclusion.
But he did it at the level of consciousness. He was not fomenting an uprising. He was destabilizing the very consciousness that undergirds empire. That's what he was doing. And that's what we can be doing.
Thank you so much. A question? Others? John?
So I'm noticing in my faith community that there's a lot of fracturing. And some of it's around leadership and a lack of intentional building community. And I feel like that's part of what's going on, is people are not taking the time, because it does take time, to make sure that community is part of something that they value and will grow. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, and I think fracturing, we happen to be living in this moment where, you know, there are fault lines all over the place. Fault lines in families, even. And let me recommend the work of a woman. This is a sort of tangential, Joan, to your question, but let me present this. There's a woman named Paula Green who, do you know,
Yeah, she works in that school.
up in Massachusetts, and she, her community started this exchange with a small town in Kentucky, a town that was very Trump supporting community. And they started this exchange with this progressive town in Massachusetts and this very conservative town in Kentucky. And some of the Kentucky folks came up to stay with them in Massachusetts, and they started to learn about each other's lives. And by the end of this exchange, they loved each other. And they could start to understand what was underlying their political differences. The human need, the human fear, all of it, and the things that they shared at that human level. And they began to actually let go of this cultural tendency right now to polarize and to label one another. And so I really think that that's what we need to be about. And maybe we need to just have more potluck suppers where, political conversations are just off the table. And we're gonna learn about each other, and we're gonna find out, what are we struggling with? To really meet one another at that very, very human level. I think it's essential. And also because of the prevalence now of social media, where we sort of have this pseudo community, but it's not community. It's not at all. So I really do believe that forming community is essential, and that begins in very small ways. Just really one-on-one, small groups. So it's like, yeah, from that then it can spread, it can radiate out into a wider community too. And we have to want to, and there are always some who will want to do it. And that was the case like with these two towns. You know, there were people who, I mean, they were afraid too. These people from Kentucky were afraid to go to Massachusetts. They were afraid. But they were willing. So to find people who are willing to start to meet one another and to create that kind of a safe place where people are not going to be attacked. You know, there's no mushroom cloud here. You know, that's not what this is about. Yeah. So you work with people who are willing. You work with the people who are willing. And then others will begin to notice and say, well, that looks pretty interesting. Maybe I'll try that out. Yeah, you always have to start with people who are willing.
Other questions? Jim?
I like what you said, and it's very optimistic, and I like it. But there seems to be, I'll say at the polls, it seems to be very seductive right now. The exclusion, the whole idea of exclusion. And I walk around and I think, I'm sort of in the middle, and I feel lonely. Because what gets on the news or gets in social media is the extremes of polls, and you can feel like, oh, I guess I should be leaning over here, I should be going over there, because it's just it feels lonely in the middle, and I think it's I don't think people really know it. I mean, I think it's a strange feeling, and I think it happens in both politics right now, and in some cases with religion. I mean, I'm new to this Quaker thing, and I visit, and very often I'll walk in, it's not very crowded, you know, and I'll come here, and then I'll go back to my Catholic church, and I'll hear, and it's crowded, and I hear that one holy Catholic apostolic, you know what I mean, which is what I grew up in, and it just seems so excluding, yet seductive. So I don't know how we get over that hump.
Well, chances are, yeah, and I hear what you're saying, that it feels lonely in the middle, and chances are there are a lot of people who are in the middle and they just aren't getting the airtime. So I'm not exactly sure if there's a question that you have in that, but just an observation, right? An observation, yeah.
Or do you have a way of getting over that?
I can't say that I do. I can't say that I do, except to just say that there are probably a whole lot more people in your, you know, part of the spectrum than you realize. I guess the challenge is finding them, right? Right. Does anybody else have any ideas?
Well, I might suggest that there is being in the middle, you kind of think of the medium, the mediator, the person who isn't alienated from both sides but has a bridge. So instead of feeling like you're in the breach, if you felt like you had the possibility of being the bridge, that's one way of looking at being in the middle that might, kind of a change of consciousness also changes how you drive, as you were saying.
I mean, a long time ago, it was a misnomer when Nixon said the moral majority, because he didn't mean the moral majority.
Right.
You know, and
Right.
that would be good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my thought was that often we are looking for the large group and we should be looking for the small group. And it's harder. I belong to a very small meeting. It's really small. And for a lot of years, I kept feeling like we were being told we needed to just go away because we were too small. We haven't. And we are pretty strong as a small meeting. And I've gotten more and more convinced that this is actually a really good thing. It would be nice to be bigger, and maybe we will. But not looking at size is perhaps really important, and looking at what you're getting.
And I want to piggyback on what John was saying, that oftentimes the people in the middle can be trusted by people on the extremes because they're not like those people. So I really appreciate what you said, John, about being that connector, serving that connector function.
I just wanted to comment on that because I don't think it's a matter, at least my experience has been not so much that I'm in the middle, but that I can, whoever I'm with, I can start to empathize with. And that can drive me crazy. I remember I couldn't listen to Ronald Reagan's fireside chats because after a while my head would start to nod. But what I'm seeing now is that empathy that I have is actually part of what we need. And it doesn't mean I agree with everything. But it is finding some connection, a heart connection to other people. And I just wanted to say that I think one thing that I don't know if you can do this, Jim, and I'm trying to learn how to do it or practice it, but a friend of mine talks about holding space for transformation. And I try to just do that wherever I go. And again, that doesn't mean agreeing with people, but it does mean holding a space open for spirit, for energy, for light, for love, for whatever, to start operating. And that also means that you're open to, you have to be open to change yourself.
Right. Yeah. Very.
Other friends? I just wanted to make sure you weren't signaling a failure of technology.
No, I have a question. A lot of the solution that you've presented is focused on the individual, it sounds to me. It's our responsibility to accept this new philosophy and start living our lives in that way and hopefully build community around us. But empire is an institution, and a lot of what we struggle with, or what I struggle with, is fighting against the institutions that prop up the empire. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how to build institution that props up this way of being.
It's just an us them thing.
I'm sorry? What do you think?
And I said it's also an us them thing as well. I mean, so it's also that's a really good question.
Yeah, I think at this point, I would say the institutions that we have right now mostly are, they're egoic institutions. They're institutions that have served that worldview. And it takes a while for institutions to emerge. And it takes a while for things to become institutionalized. So I think right now we are in sort of a fluid moment where it's not about the institutions yet, because those institutions will arise out of a different way of seeing things. Now I hear what you're saying about how do we then see it as a collective endeavor, right? I think that's what your question is. This is a metaphor that it just comes in my mind, that this is the way I like to think about it, that when the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, have you all heard, what happens?
Imaginal cells.
Yeah, exactly. So the body of the caterpillar completely dissolves into soup. There is nothing left of the form of that creature. And out of that soup, the DNA, there's information in the DNA that gives rise to imaginal cells, sometimes they're called organizer cells, that start to find each other. And they are what are called imaginal buds, which then form the organs of a new creature, of the vampire. And I feel like right now we're in this fluid moment where the imaginal cells are beginning to find each other. You know, we're connecting with people that we sense we somehow share a purpose in this moment. And when we come together, then we can start to form that organ. And I like to think of it more as an organ rather than an institution, because an institution is not very organic in my mind. So we are fashioning a new creature based on this capacity to connect with people who share the same purpose in this emerging butterfly. Now there's an interesting thing also that happens in the process of this of these cells finding each other, and that is when the imaginal cells begin to find each other and start to form these imaginal buds, there's still enough of the immune system intact of the caterpillar that it begins to attack them, believing that they are a foreign body. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, there we are under attack.
Yes. And of course the imaginal buds don't attack back. What they do is they keep forming their imaginal buds. They keep finding each other. They keep reinforcing their purpose. They keep growing into the organs that they are destined to be. And so for me, it's not about attacking the attacker, but it's about continuing to form, to find, to connect with the people who share the vision and have a similar purpose. And that is how we begin to really form the new entity.
Thank you. Wayne?
I'm thinking, in addition to the ego of our institutions and we also, when expressing ourselves, I'm learning we need to look at how, if we're expressing our own ego, or are we expressing our divine selves, our infinite self? And on that individual basis, I think once we're learning that, no, that's not my ego I want to express, but that's my divine nature I want to express, then our consciousness will raise on that level. And I think we affect those around us as they've seen us on one side and they see that developing expression that we're putting out there as well. And I think we're changing individuals that we come in contact with. It's where that's the point that I'm learning how to overcome my ego and express my authentic self. And so I'm on chapter 1, but you just took me to the back of the book, which is great because it's making me think much further beyond myself, which is important, but I think it's very important to understand that in ourselves, that we understand, are we feeding our own ego? And I'm thinking what you were saying about, I don't want to go to a smaller church, but the larger one seems to be the way to go. Is that good for you? I'm not pointing you out, but I was trying to think how that would affect that thought or answering that question. Are we feeding our ego, or are we expressing our divine nature? And I think that's helpful as a path of thought.
Yes. And we are all in this together. You know, we're all, those of us who feel that, you know, we have a role to play in this transitional moment. And actually, I think we probably all have a role to play. The question is, how aware are we at this point that we have a role to play? You know, my ego shows up consistently. You know, I mean, yes, I've had these moments of tremendous lucidity, but in the passage that I read you, I was going to read another following passage, but you'll just have to buy the book. You know, my ego like got blown out of the water in that experience, but it hadn't gone away. It's just like been marginalized for a little bit. And so it is a constant process of letting go of those tendencies. And one of the things that I think about in my own journey is, so the mind that is in this idea of separateness and generating this illusory self that I call the ego, it has its stories that it plays out. You know, it's got its repertoire of stories. And one of my tasks, and one of the ways that I think about it is, it's about suspending. Now, when you pick up a novel, you're supposed to suspend your disbelief, right? So you can enter the narrative. Well, when we're doing this ego work, it's just the opposite. We suspend our belief in those stories because they are stories. They're stories. They're not reality, they're stories. And so part of this process is suspending my belief in the stories. Because my belief in them is what feeds them and perpetuates them. So I absolutely hear you, what you're saying, and that it is a collective effort, and yes, the more that we're all engaged in this together, the stronger we become. And Quakers know this. I mean, that's why you come to meeting, to do this together, to do it in community.
Right there.
Hi, I have a more easy question for you. I was wondering some of what you're saying about the ego and so on, how much you've read Eastern philosophies, and if you've been influenced by that.
You know, I have, and it was for many, well, okay, this is, I could go off here, but I have read some of it, and much of it I read in the aftermath of that experience that I told you about. Although the Tao Te Ching has been very influential in my life for a very, very long time. And of course, I've read some about Buddhism and really appreciate a lot of that. The challenge that I faced, one of the challenges that I faced in this particular experience that I told you about, was my Christian background did not equip me for that. It did not equip me for that. And that was part of why in the aftermath, I felt so lost and so alone. They never taught me in Sunday school about spiritual awakening. They never taught me that. So I think that Eastern understandings, Eastern spiritualities have a tremendous amount to teach us, a tremendous amount.
To add on that have you come across Upanishads? Upanishad is an Indian philosophy, actually. Vedas written 5,000 years back, and that Upanishads speak about spirituality and almost all the ideas you were talking about. And every chapter ends that Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, that is in Sanskrit, which means the whole world is one family.
There you go. And you see, so my book talks about how, and yes. So in my book, I talk about how, and I believe that is the way Jesus experienced reality, and he knew himself as one with reality, and all of us as one with reality. But what happened in the case of Christianity is it became viewed through that egoic lens, and it became affiliated with empire. We have an imperial version of Christianity, which has completely distorted the message. Completely distorted the message.
I was just gonna sneak on in myself there for a
You
second.
already had two.
I know.
I'm counting. I have had in this very room openings this year that have utterly shaken me so that I feel the cracks in my body where there are voids. I'm pretty mad right now about the doctrine of discovery from 1493. And I committed to a room full of indigenous folks here that I would continue to hold this horrible, horrible truth in awareness. Doctrine of Discovery in 1493, the Pope issued that Christians could be deputized anywhere in the world. Wherever they went, they could claim the lands and animate and inanimate objects as their own and make them slaves. I am not happy. I have little known to me native background from this continent, that the shame and fear and abuse that was given in the Christian boarding schools, and there were Quaker boarding schools as well, have visited on my rightful culture. So I'm reclaiming that now, and I feel like there's, and I think we all have places of void and emptiness that if we're able to find what they are, and out of love for life and kin, go there and heal. I'm in the process of doing that, and realizing that my grandmother didn't tell me anything for a reason. And in this room, I heard person after person say, oh no, grandparents didn't tell them anything because of shame. And they talked about the cellular memory of 4 and 5 generations. It takes that long to heal. So I'm quite connected in a way to those imaginal cells. They have given me hope in looking at things now. I know a spiritual truth that comes through my cells from a native background that I didn't get. I got it through cellular memory. And I never heard anybody mention those words except for in this room. But I knew them. We each are given a measure of void and pain. And I think if we're able to look at what do we love, what are we willing to work towards to make right, if we are each faithful to that measure, we find those communities of passion for justice. And I did not expect to find that when I came to that the truth and healing, but before that, the Doctrine of Discovery was a movie.
Oh, right.
And so that cracked me open. And I used to lead workshops on transforming the patriarchy into the peaceable kingdom. This was 30 years ago. And I realize now we were only pruning the branches of the tree because the master's tools will never unlock the master's house. And now I know the root of the tree. I know the root, and it was that Doctrine of Discovery that has really polluted and changed the course. So for me, reclaiming a culture that had been almost completely genocided, and the genocide has affected my personal life. So I think for each of us to find, where is the hurt so great that we can find the balm that heals. And nature is certainly a big, big, big part of that. So thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
Yeah, and that's in terms of, probably some of you have heard about the field of epigenetics now, where trauma is passed down through the genes, through the DNA. So, we may be experiencing the symptoms of trauma from something that our ancestors went through. Yeah.
I would like to thank you very much. I have a just to build a little bit on what you were going to say, which I kind of knew you were going to go in that direction, but one of the things that came out of the conference and has been reminded of us, there are traditions that preceded our own where separateness was not part of their culture or consciousness.
Absolutely.
So we have allies in the world. And so part of what we need to do is to be decolonizing our own minds. For those of us who've grown up in a Cartesian enlightenment, it's what you know and can manipulate, to welcome the people who can, in fact, teach us right living.
Yes.
And in that regard, I would like to invite you all to our Liberation Theology Conference this October 11th through the 14th, which is called Within and Without, Liberation Theology in Social Movements Today. Not quite the right title, but very close. In which we have people from a variety of faiths and who are working with the people who remember and can help lead us to right relationship with the earth and its peoples as one living system. So there's hope, and we're trying to feed it throughout this year with our theme of liberation. And thank you so much for this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
I would invite you at this point to